Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be all about representative deliberative processes, or what we generally just call for shorthand, deliberation. And deliberation is when you have an event that is moderated and constructed to bring citizens together to discuss some type of policy issue or ballot initiative or even constitutional change as a way to give citizens input into the policymaking process. And if you dial back to episode 117 with Dr. Patricia Rossini, we talked a bit about deliberation and how online political talk doesn't quite live up to those ideals because it's not structured. It's usually not about arriving at any sort of consensus. And the structure of online spaces doesn't necessarily facilitate the most deliberative dialogue. But the question is, what type of deliberation is actually out there? What are governments doing to get citizens involved in the policy-making process? So my guest today is Ieva Česnulaitytė. She is the co-author of a report put out by the OECD last year entitled Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave. And there, Ieva and her colleague looked at almost 300 examples of deliberation going back to the 1980s and across various countries and really charted out what are the best practices for those deliberative processes, and also what variations happen across them. Because when we think about deliberation, I think we tend to think about the citizens' assembly, which is where you get people at a hotel to hash out a policy issue alongside experts. But this is not the only model of deliberation. And I think it's interesting. I never really see this discussed in the academic literature. It's just talked about as deliberation and not the plurality of forms of deliberation that are actually being put into practice. So the impetus for this episode came when I saw an op-ed in Nature about the report and how, due to the coronavirus pandemic and social distancing, these deliberative processes are moving online. So they're not necessarily stopping, but they're being adapted to a pandemic situation where either specific systems are being built or citizens are zooming in and carrying out deliberative processes, which obviously poses some challenges, but it may also provide some opportunities for how these processes could be digitalized in the future. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the report. You can find a link to that in the show notes, as well as the op-ed I just mentioned. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Ieva Česnulaitytė. Again, she's a policy analyst at the OECD. Ieva, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So to set the stage here, why don't we start out by outlining for the listeners what types of processes we're talking about here? What exactly are deliberative processes according to the criteria outlined by the OECD?
So a representative deliberative process is a type of innovative citizen participation. So it usually refers to a randomly selected group of citizens that is broadly representative of the society, which is gathered for at least several days to learn and deliberate over a specific policy issue and then provide collective recommendations to a public authority that has gathered this group or commissioned the process.
Yeah, and you've outlined a number of different types of these deliberative processes, which I want to get into in a second. But first, when you were making the report, there's 289 cases of deliberation that you studied. And I was just curious if we could start out by talking about how you actually went and selected those cases and kind of where they come from.
Indeed, it's quite an interesting database of close to 300 examples. So firstly, we have identified the three main criteria that we wanted all of the deliberative processes in the database to meet, so that they would be government initiated, so meaning that they do have impact in the policy making. There were at least 1 day of face-to-face meetings, and so they were all as well face-to-face and at that point not online. And the way that we went about finding these processes is, of course, firstly, some desk research, targeted requests to organizations, policymakers, and academics studying these processes or working on these processes, on designing and implementing them, as well as outreach to our innovative citizen participation network, democracy R&D network, and we've also had an open call for cases of examples of representative deliberative processes where everybody could submit one if they knew about it. So after having collected all of this data, we filled in a huge table where there were around 60 criteria about each of these processes that we wanted to know. So it was about their length, the country, the issue that it covered, and what happened with the recommendations, how the participants were selected, etc. And then we also validated some of the most recent cases with the organizers of these deliberative processes.
A lot of times you tend to think about deliberation as, just one type of process, but within that, there's at least 12 different models of deliberative processes that you identified. And you could sort of group those into 4 overarching types of processes that governments typically use. So could you explain those 4 types of deliberative processes for us and why certain models might be chosen over others?
Indeed, you are correct that usually when people talk about deliberation, they imagine citizens' assembly. But it is really not the only way that deliberation can be done, so which is something we have discovered while doing the research. So indeed, there are 12 different models of these processes that fall under 4 types of purpose. So we've seen that these bigger processes, such as a citizens' assembly, citizens' jury, consensus conference, or a planning cell that gather a little bit more people and then they take slightly longer, they are the ones that are best suited to gather informed citizen recommendations on policy questions. So those recommendations are rather detailed, and citizens have had substantive amount of time to deliberate over them. Another category are processes that help gather citizen opinions on policy questions. So saying that they are a little bit more on the surface, however, still very well deliberated. So these are the processes such as a G1000 process, which gathers a very big portion of the society, so up to 1,000 participants, for example. Citizens' council, citizens' dialogue, deliberative polls, and worldwide views. The third category are processes that help provide informed citizen evaluation of ballot measures. So the process in this category that we found is a citizens' initiative review, something that originated in the US. In this case, citizens help review arguments for and against a ballot measure, and then sort of their opinion and their review of these arguments is provided to all of the voters before they vote on a certain ballot to help inform their decision. And finally, the fourth category are permanent deliberative bodies. So we've seen that recently some of the policymakers and governments have been looking into ways to make deliberation a more permanent way that decisions are taken. So there are a couple of models that we've identified, such as the Ost-Belgian model in the German-speaking community of Belgium, where citizens have an agenda-setting power of these ad hoc deliberative processes. So it is a more permanent way to sort of identify what issues citizens would like to discuss through deliberation. And also they do have this monitoring and follow-up function to see how recommendations of these one-off ad hoc processes have been implemented by the government. And also a city observatory example from the Madrid case as well is one of the ways that we've seen these processes more permanently implemented.
That's interesting. And I know this is a bit speculative, but do you have any idea about how, I'm just curious about how you arrive at all these different types of models. Is it that the governments just kind of say, hey, let's just construct it this way and try it out? Or are they trying to develop something that they think works best for their community? Or I guess, what do you think explains the variation in the development of these different models of the deliberative processes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we can actually observe that most of these models have been developed by academics or civil society too. So some of them originate from different countries. For example, Planning Cell originates from Germany, which sort of has been developed according to the specific context that was suited for Germany at the time, for example, or some of the other ones, such as consensus conference, originated from Denmark and were used to sort of review new technology and the way that citizens react to it. So it is really, I feel, more based on the context where they were sort of originated and developed, and then in the end adapted and used by governments in different countries.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the report you outline several policy areas that these deliberative processes have been utilized for, and the majority of those tend to focus on urban planning and health, really at the local level, which kind of makes sense to get citizens' input on those things that really affect their lives. But at a sort of broader level, you're looking at all these different processes and coming at some suggestive criteria for when any of these should be used. And those are things that deal with values-driven dilemmas, complex problems that require trade-offs, and long-term issues that go beyond the short-term incentives of an election. So why are deliberative processes particularly suited to these three types of issues?
I think this is also a great question, because when looking at the data, we were really sort of curious to see for what types of policy issues these processes are going to be used. And we've seen that it is indeed a huge diversity of various policy issues that these processes have been used to help tackle difficult policy decisions. So it's not necessarily about the type of policy issue, but really about the type of problem. So what you've mentioned, the first one would be values-based dilemmas. We can see that indeed lots of policy issues seem technical in nature, but there is often an underlying level of ethical questions and values below that question. So the society, in a way, needs to agree what values we are basing our decisions on and what kind of society we'd like to be. And for that type of conversation to happen, you do need a broadly representative group of citizens from all walks of life to be able to have their vision of the future and of the society in the room, to be able to find that sort of a consensus or common ground on a broad idea where we're going as a society together. And representative deliberative processes really do provide this type of platform for this conversation to take place. The second type of problem that we've identified are long-term issues that go beyond the short-term incentives of electoral cycles. So this is something also quite interesting, because indeed, electoral cycles do tend to, make an impact on what kind of decisions are taken and at which point of the electoral cycle. And if you do have this independent representative group of people making decisions on behalf of society, and they have no political interests in making this decision, they are maybe a little bit more free to come up with ideas and solutions that let's say political parties would not necessarily be able to suggest because of, let's say, their electoral situation and what their electorate would deem appropriate, for example. And the third type of problem we've identified is a complex problems that require trade-offs. So in this situation, there's usually a need also to find a common ground and to be able to identify how a certain policy solution might be affecting different types of groups. So it is difficult to achieve that sort of lens from all of these people from different walks of life and how a specific decision will affect them, especially if it's complex and requires trade-offs and might affect some groups more than others without having these people in the room. So deliberative processes are particularly useful for bringing this diversity in the room. So these are the main arguments for it.
Yeah, I'm interested in this one about, having processes that look longer than the electoral cycle, because often politicians are campaigning on issues that sort of need immediate attention. And on the one hand, that could be good for, let's say, a ruling party, a party in government, because they can say that, hey, look, this policy measure we're proposing has been arrived at by citizens, not us. And even though if it goes against our platforms, maybe that's a way to shift accountability for the decision making. But on the other hand, if the deliberative outcome is something that goes against the ruling party's, values or agenda, maybe it will be more difficult to implement, because that could draw criticism from the public. So I guess I'm wondering on what's your impression of these policies actually being implemented, because the citizens might not arrive at the same decision as the values of the ruling party, for example.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, indeed, these processes are a way to overcome sometimes a deadlock situation where has not really been a political decision made, let's say, and maybe normally supporters would not really approve, let's say, of a certain decision, but where a decision needs to be made, which was the case in the Irish Citizens' Assembly on the ban on abortion that was in the Constitution, where Citizens' Assembly was very instrumental in removing that ban. In a way, we do recommend these processes as a way for governments to have more information to make the best possible decision. However, not in all of the cases, recommendations by citizens are fully implemented because of various reasons, such as also, for example, the political leanings of the leading party. But what we've seen is that actually in 40% of cases, all of the recommendations have been implemented. And around 30% of deliberative processes have had more than 50% of their recommendations implemented. So this does show that actually what citizens come up with has a lot of value for the government and do in fact end up being implemented in the end.
Definitely. And I mean, whether the policy is implemented or not is one measure of success. But you've also looked at these almost 300 cases and come up with a set of criteria for what actually makes a successful deliberative process. Because as you mentioned, most people think of citizen assemblies, which is where you get a bunch of people, in a hotel or something and have them deliberate on something for a couple of days. And that can be quite expensive. And you find that the average citizens assembly costs just under 2 million euros. So when would a taxpayer know that money was sort of best used in a deliberative process rather than something else like an expert consultation?
There's, I think, lots of dimensions in this question to tackle. So, yes, some of the bigger assemblies, for example, the Citizens' Convention on Climate in France, have costed around 2 million euros. However, some of the smaller ones really do cost much less. So it's not something to be scared of. But on the other hand, taking good decisions and democracy does have a price in a way. And you think about how much money is spent on elections. Maybe a deliberative process is not that expensive in the end if you compare to the price of the cost of elections or the cost of failed policy that sometimes ends up happening in the end. Another thing I wanted to mention that, in fact, expert consultations are in a way part of deliberative process too. So it's not that to say that they're not involved. However, the role of experts is a little bit different because then in a deliberative process, you have stakeholders and experts giving presentations to the citizens to then inform their discussions. So by having a deliberative process, you sort of have two in one. But it is also about inclusive and sustainable policy making. So ensuring that the decision is what the society considers is the best way forward and an agreement on the next move and a variety of views from all walks of life considered. And in the end, potentially more support for implementation of the policy decisions taken, which is also something important because we can take a decision, but then there could be difficulties and lack of support for implementation as well. Also, deliberation, but also participation too, has, in the end, instrumental benefits, such as, let's say, better results, but also intrinsic benefits, such as better and more democratic policy-making process. So there are different arguments why deliberation is something to go for. In terms of success, it also depends on how you define it. So success can be quality recommendations that are implemented. But what we also consider success is that, the feeling of trust and efficacy in the participants and also extended in the broader society which is cultivated amongst the participants, but also between the government and the citizens. Well, we've seen a range of other benefits of representativeness and deliberation. I could elaborate a little bit more if interested.
Yeah, definitely. So what types of benefits? I mean, I can definitely imagine both for the participants, they get something, as you said, sort of intrinsic out of it, but then also people in the society are probably going to be supportive of having other people give input to the policy making rather than elites. So what are some of those benefits?
So first of all, of course, better policy outcomes, because deliberation allows for gathering public judgment rather than public opinions or just people top of mind ideas. So in a way, you have an agreement and so a deeper understanding of the issue and a solution that is more well thought through. It also offers greater legitimacy to make harder choices, to support some decisions that would not have been taken otherwise because of lack of political support, for example, or social support. It helps, as I mentioned, enhance public trust in government and in democratic institutions too, because citizens are this way given an effective role in public decision making. It is also a signal of civic respect and empowerment of citizens, and it does make governance more inclusive by opening the door to more representative groups of people and more diversity of voices to be heard. And finally, it can help strengthen integrity, prevent corruption in the decision-making process, and to ensure that groups and individuals with money and power cannot have undue influence on public decisions. And some of the recent research has shown that these processes can help counteract polarization and disinformation.
Yeah, I think everything you listed is, I think most people are going to be on board with from a healthy democracy perspective. But moving a bit into the online aspect here, I want to follow up on a couple things that you just said. But first, I mean, clearly these processes are going to work best in person when you have people physically together, talking out issues, hearing expert consultations, because that face-to-face aspect really does increase trust and this understanding between where different people in the society are coming from. But that just hasn't been possible with lockdowns and social distancing rules. So what types of online deliberation practices or processes have we seen taking place during the pandemic?
So what we've seen that face-to-face processes have been adapted to online. So indeed, we are actually at the moment updating our database because we've stopped our data collection at October 2019, or it was before the pandemic. And now we are in the midst of updating it and also gathering all of these hybrid and online deliberative processes that have been taking place over the past year and a half. And we've seen that there's already been at least 100 of new processes, which shows both that the deliberative wave is still very much growing, but also that it was possible to make this move to online deliberation too. So we've seen quite a few citizens' juries and assemblies on the COVID, how we deal with it and what the recovery is going to look like. But also quite a few climate assemblies happening online. So, for example, at the moment, there's a Poznan citizens panel taking place in Poland that is fully online and that is covering issues such as climate change and the way that the city is going to tackle these issues. What we've also seen is that the online processes are not really easier or cheaper than face-to-face processes. So they are equally, let's say, as demanding. However, not impossible to do.
Yeah, and because I mean, on the one hand, I think the downside is you really can't replace those person-to-person interactions. But on the upside, perhaps it does offer the ability to be more inclusive by, not having people travel, or perhaps scaling up, having more participants into a discussion. So that all goes into this idea of inclusivity could be increased online, perhaps. But I guess I want to ask you, what are some of the pros and cons of holding these processes online versus the more traditional face-to-face interactions?
Well, most of my sort of observations here are based on discussions with our team and with some of the practitioners and researchers and policymakers within our Innovative Citizen Participation Network, because we haven't really completed any more research on this, even though we're working on it at the moment. But some of the things that we can already see is that, for example, I just mentioned the Poznan Citizens panel. They've had 4 learning sessions for the participants of this process, and they were all live streamed online for anybody to watch and to see. So this, you can already see, is like one of the pros of the online processes is that you can extend some of the benefits of these deliberative processes, such as the extensive learning about the issue, to the broader society, because in a way it's very easy to make the learning sessions available for everyone to see if it's online. So that I would consider one of the pros. And indeed, you've mentioned a little bit that there could be these transnational moments to deliberative processes, which is also something that online deliberation can help enable and facilitate. So more large-scale or cross-border processes can take place when they are online, and if there's technical possibilities for those. There's also some of the other elements that these online deliberations can bring in, such as, all of these polling tools, different voting tools that can be used, that are now more and more common. And in a way, when the whole process is online, it can be potentially more transparent to the broader society, which is also a key element of a deliberative process, which we've identified in our principles of good practice for deliberative process, is the transparency and accountability of these processes. So there are ways that digital can help enhance those moments. And if we are thinking about some of the drawbacks of the online deliberative processes, I mean, one of them is probably the Zoom fatigue that everybody feels. And you really need to, if face-to-face, you could gather participants for a weekend or for a full day of face-to-face deliberation, because, it's a fun experience. You get to meet people, to learn, you have those coffee breaks, you have those social moments. But online is slightly different, so you really need to be mindful how you break up those sessions so that people are actually engaged and not tired. So you need to space them out a little bit. And also, probably most of the people already spend lots of time on video calls at work. So that is something really to keep in mind. And also rather clear that, digital requires certain skills and infrastructure, and a digital divide is an issue to keep in mind. So not necessarily all of the participants that you'd like to invite, maybe especially on those that are a little bit older, have necessary skills or even technical devices to be able to join deliberative processes. But we've seen that these are the things that were overcome by actually providing the tools and the necessary help for those participants to participate.
Right. And if we think about the digital divide in sort of global terms, with a lot of people in the global south having internet access through their phone, but not necessarily a computer, then in a sense, to make this process work, everyone has to have a kind of stable connection and be able to be heard. And so I think when you said that these online processes can be sometimes just as expensive as face-to-face, I guess a big part of that is providing devices and providing training to use those devices can easily start to bring the costs up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's true that in some cases there is a need to either, provide laptops that would normally be, let's say, in the library, to bring them to the participants, maybe to show them how to use those, because we've heard in some of the cases there were people who have never even used a computer before, so they did need a little bit of support to do it, to be able to do it. However, in the end, they did, and they were happy to participate and to have learned how to even use a computer. So in a way, participation in a deliberative process was for them an opportunity to even learn some of those digital skills that they didn't have.
Definitely. And, I want to ask you about social media platforms because there is a lot of research looking at, a Twitter hashtag or a Facebook group and trying to figure out, how deliberative is this conversation based on, different metrics like civility or respect and things like that. But they tend to find that deliberation on social media is quite low. And as we talked about in a previous episode, it's not that these platforms are necessarily designed for formal deliberative processes, right? So in terms of designing an online ideal space for deliberation, are there any crucial factors that you think should be built in to an online system or maybe into a social media platform?
Yeah, that's a great question because we're all now keeping in mind the way that social media somehow structures also the social dialogue. And indeed, I am not convinced that they are a best platform for deliberation. So, what we've discussed a little bit with some of the practitioners in the field as well is that, in a way, the digital community and the participation or deliberative community, they're not very, let's say, linked or working together. And this is maybe one of the issues why we don't have tools that are very well suited for deliberation or designed for deliberation, because we just apply and use the tools that are existing. So we actually would be very interesting to see what would come out of it if we had these two communities working together on something that is specifically built for that purpose of deliberation. In terms of crucial factors or principles, I mean, I could say that transparency is key. And even all of our good practice principles for deliberation are important to keep in mind when we talk about that. So we have, let's say, principles of also privacy, of space for group deliberation, on providing information and time and things like that. So all of them could be really important. And what is also rather important is to make sure that the platform itself is compatible with certain democratic values that we believe in and that we uphold for the deliberative process. So, things as anonymity, privacy, etc., could be considered important.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you exactly about anonymity because one thing that the research tends to show is that if the platforms allows you to hide your anonymity, like on YouTube or Reddit, where you can make kind of any screen name you want, that these conversations tend to be less civil. And the idea is that because you're not tied to your personal identity, you might say something you wouldn't say to someone face to face. So if we think about moving some of these panels online, on the one hand, anonymity might benefit people being more honest and open, saying what they really think, but they might do so in a way that is not how they would interact with a real person. So is your impression that, having someone be tied to their real identity is crucial for these processes to work?
In my opinion, it is rather crucial for the reasons of legitimacy of the process and trust. So it's important that participants are not anonymous in this case. Their names don't have to be public, let's say, before the process ends, for example, for privacy reasons. That is completely fine. But in a way, we don't really see a problem of people not being honest or say what they really think in a deliberative process. They normally do because of the way that the process is designed. So because they start their deliberation in these smaller moderated groups that are private due to appropriate facilitation, people are encouraged to share also their fears and reservations about a specific policy issue that they're tackling in the very beginning of the process. They do have this moment where they build a trust with other participants and they do share their concerns privately. And then once that is out and that is behind them, they are then able to engage into sort of more informed deliberation after that. So it is also because during a deliberative process, there is this effort to create an environment of respect, non-judgment amongst the participants. So it is a space that is suited to express what you actually think. So yeah, in my opinion, there is no need for anonymity in a deliberative process.
Mm. And lastly, I'd like to ask about the transnational potential of these processes. We talked about context mattering, but I wonder if there's perhaps been, too much context or too narrow a context where so many of these processes are focused on like urban planning initiatives in a city. And as we also talked about, there's different models of these processes that have been enacted. So it's hard to build maybe a general consensus about what is the best type, or if you took the same deliberative process and put it into a different city, would the outcome be the same? So I'm wondering whether one key benefit of the online processes is that you could have people debate from different nationalities, from different cities, perhaps with a hypothetical scenario. And maybe that would teach us something broader about how democracy is understood or is understood differently in different places. So I know the European Commission ran one of these transnational online assemblies, but in your view, do you think that expanding the scope of participants is something that digital could help us with, and perhaps tell us more about the fitness of democracy generally, sort of beyond the locality or the nation state?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea of sort of having a hypothetical issue where we could compare what people think, let's say, in different communities about a certain issue. However, maybe more from an academic perspective, because normally we would need sort of to contextualize a certain decision and a policy issue. So we are looking to find a solution that is best in a specific context and a specific place, and who are better to know what is best, let's say, for their either city or their country than the inhabitants. So in a way, that's the reason why we have a representative sample of the population that is concerned with the policy issue, because they are the ones having a legitimate interest in it. However, there have been quite some transnational processes. I think around 3% of all of the processes in our database are transnational. And there's some more coming up in the context on the conference on the future of Europe, because it seems to be going to that direction. So this is indeed something that online deliberation can be helpful with, and connecting all of these people, and also providing, for example, simultaneous translation and all of these things that are much harder if that would have happened face to face.
Yeah, I think it's something that is still being developed, right? Best practices are still coming out. And I think that that your report does an excellent job really outlining what are some of the key fundamentals across these different processes. So it'll be exciting to see whether the online does have a staying power in the future. But Ieva, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Was happy to. Thank you very much.
I've just been speaking with Ieva Česnulaitytė, policy analyst at the OECD. You can find a link to the report we've been discussing down in the episode description. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Jean-Christophe Planton from the London School of Economics about platformization, infrastructuralization, and his latest work on programmable infrastructure as a model for networks. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.